environment, and terrain. This video illustrates how emergency response considerations and shelter-in-place decisions should take into account these factors: how a chlorine cloud moves between obstacles, the fluid flow characteristics of the cloud, and how the concentration gradient affects the shape and movement of the release cloud. Chlorine is heavier than air, and after the initial release has subsided, will settle and move close to the ground. This trial also shows how obstacles, such as buildings, structures, and vehicles, influence the dispersion cloud's size and movement. In this trial, you can see how the chlorine cloud's movement is channeled between obstacles. In this example, shipping containers are used to represent buildings and structures. Due in part to chlorine's heavier-than-air characteristic, you can see how the containers block and direct the flow of the cloud, and once the inertia of the initial release ends, how little chlorine rises above the container tops. The chlorine cloud is diverted parallel to the containers and moves off the pad. In this trial, you can see how the absence of concentrated structures, the shipping containers, results in a somewhat narrower cloud. The chlorine is not being deflected perpendicular to the initial momentum of the release and the wind direction. The response consideration takeaways from this example are: buildings and structural congestion will influence chlorine movement during a release, and the presence of buildings and structures can allow crosswind chlorine movement, expanding the size of the cloud. Three factors that influence a chlorine cloud's flow are the direction of the release, wind speed and direction, and gravity. In this trial, you can see that once the inertia from the release ends, overtopping of the containers ends. The cloud does not rise very high. The upwind and crosswind expansion of the cloud also ends once the initial release has ceased, as shown by the visible edge of the cloud. During a release that is vertically downward, the maximum upwind boundary is established in the first 20 seconds. At 7 minutes, the chlorine cloud essentially has maintained its original shape. Note the narrower plume that forms behind the main cloud as the liquid evaporates. In this example, a 135-degree release exhibits no upwind chlorine movement. The width of the cloud is established within the first 36 seconds. During a vertical upward release, there is no visible chlorine cloud around the dissemination tank. The visible cloud remains above ground, well downwind. After 8 minutes, the visible chlorine cloud is still above grade. The response consideration takeaways from this example are: wind and gravity become the main influencers of the chlorine cloud once the inertia of the initial release has ended. The direction of the release influences the initial direction of the chlorine flow and concentrations. And upwind movement of chlorine during a release is limited and does not occur after release on flat ground. In addition to obstacles and fluid flow characteristics, the concentration gradient will influence a chlorine cloud's behavior. In this view, at about 1 minute, some chlorine is visible on top of the containers closest to the camera at a height of about 9 feet. But most visible chlorine is below the container tops. The vertical rise of the cloud ends as soon as the release inertia ends, which occurs at about the 35-second mark. After about 1 minute and 30 seconds, chlorine is no longer visible on top of the containers. During this 135-degree release, there is no evidence of visible chlorine upwind. Crosswind visible chlorine just reaches the edge of the pad. During this vertical up release, there is no chlorine around the dissemination tank during the initial release. The dissemination tank auto-refrigerates at about 40 seconds. A narrow band of chlorine is visible at grade and downwind from the release point at about 4 minutes, when auto-refrigeration has significantly slowed the release rate. Chlorine concentration is still visible at a considerable height above ground at about 8 minutes. The response consideration takeaways from this example are: vertical releases may not be influenced by a concentration of obstacles in the immediate area of the release. Vertical releases can negate the advantages of downward or at elevation releases, such as restricted cloud height, but vertical releases may provide opportunities for upwind and crosswind escape paths. From an emergency response perspective, the results from these dispersion trials may support these considerations. Because a chlorine cloud does not generally rise to great heights during releases at elevation and will flow around obstacles, shelter in place at higher elevations can avoid higher chlorine concentrations. And if the shelter in place location is directly downwind of the release point, the shelter in place duration may be longer due to liquid evaporation after the initial